Hey everyone, I am so happy to be hosting slash moderating this. I don't even remember what I called it. I think YA SFF debut panel, or some amalgamation of all of those words, kind of in a row. I'm really happy to be moderating this panel. Also, well, all the books are out too. That's not that's not always the case. So it's really, I love when like people can actually go and find the books in a very real way. Just for a brief kind of intro of me, I'm my name is Lily, and I am hosting this panel, kind of book human, I guess, kind of around the internet and sort of on a variety of different social media places, but initially book blogger. And I'm really excited for this panel. By the way, before we start, I wanted to address slash mention that, of course, we don't tolerate any harassment or any kind of like verbal awfulness. And so that's just a forewarning that if that happens, then, certain punitive actions will have to be done, I guess. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much about that. And I want to go into the panel and have the authors introduce themselves, because I also have a lot of important questions to me. And there'll also be a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, just a reminder, you can kind of drop them throughout the chat, throughout the whole thing, or, when I ask for questions later, do what you want. Either one is totally fine with me. And let's just go into it. So let's have the authors introduce themselves.
Who's first? Hi, everybody. I'm Vanessa Lynn, and my debut is a YA fantasy called Only a Monster, which is about a monster girl whose summer is just ruined when the cute guy at work turns out to be a monster slayer. It's got it's from a monster point of view. It's got like a Captain America-like heroic antagonist, ruthless monster boy, a cute dog named Frankie. So yeah, I've been saying it's kind of like if Doctor Who met Shadowhunters. And I think Meg is next.
I think I'm next. Hi, my name is Meg. I am the author of this book, Cold the Night, Fast the Wolves. The quick pitch is that it is a sci-fi reimagining of the Iditarod sled dog race, as if it were set on Hoth. It's a little bit Julie of the Wolves, Call of the Wild, Mad Max. There's a sled race. There's a wolf and a girl. That's probably all you really need to know.
I think I'm next. Hi, I'm Lily Lanoff. I'm the author of One for All. It's a gender-bent reimagining of The Three Musketeers, in which a girl with a chronic illness trains as a musketeer and uncovers secrets, sisterhood, and self-love. I am really bad at comps, but I've been told that it's Austen meets Enola Holmes meets Kingsman comics / movies. So yeah, and I'm excited to be here.
And I'm Judy Lynn. I'm the author of Magic Steeped in Poison. And my book is also a YA fantasy following a commoner girl who is a reluctant practitioner of tea magic, and she travels to the capital to participate in a magical tea competition to try and save her dying sister. And I'm terrible at comps, so I'm not going to say any comps.
I think those comps are spot on, Lily. I really love the Kingsman one, because I feel like I never would have thought of that organically, but as soon as you mentioned it, I'm like, yeah, actually, that makes a lot of sense.
Fellow 22 debut Jeff Bishop came up with that one. He was like, oh, this is Kingsman. I was like, I'm going to steal that.
I think it's a good idea. I think it's also, as I said, super spot on. So the first question that I had actually was, I feel like in all of these worlds, and also I did want to mention that also One for All, I know we were talking as well about like, where does historical fiction fit into like sci-fi fantasy, contemporary? Obviously it's like kind of in the middle of those kinds of things. So I'm really glad that you were able to work with those two random like distinctions in my mind. But in these other worlds, but also, historical fiction worlds included in that one, I wanted to talk about how, even if things are good on an optimistic day, they're not good for everybody, often, if not always. And so I wanted to talk about what corruption and power mean in the context of your book, and kind of how does your main character see themselves in relation to power. And I mean, those are already 2 questions, so we'll just leave it at that for right now. That's already a lot. But yeah, but just about power and corruption and your main character, basically.
Am I first again?
I can go first if you don't want to. So I'll go first because I think the only sci-fi now. So in my world, the power and corruption is based on like more of the real world. So it's based on corporations, where the corporations have all the power and the rest of us do not. So that was my whole basis actually for the entire like makeup of these planets. And then my main character, Senna, does not have any money. She is not part of the corporations like the rest of us. She's not like one of these super elite members. So it's something that she has to struggle with and fight against all the time in the story. And it sort of forms the backbone of why she ends up going on this sled race. So I won't give out any spoilers, but that's sort of the basis if anybody else wants to jump in.
Yeah, for me, it's a kind of interesting question because really early on, my main character, Joan, learns that she's half monster, and that her mother's side of the family have these terrible powers that they've been using. So kind of they steal human life and then use that to travel in time. And so I guess mine kind of explores that power and corruption on a really small scale. Where Joan is initially like, I would never do such a thing. But when a monster slayer enters the picture and kills her family, she's like, maybe I'll do that. Actually, maybe I'll go back in time and steal human life. So I guess my book is almost asking the reader, what would you do if faced with that? A little bit of power, would you, to save the people you love, kind of corrupt yourself? I think Lily is next.
Yeah, I was going to say, I kind of have, it's an interesting answer because One for All is set in a slightly fantastical version of 17th century France. So we're dealing with monarchy. And all my musketeers, they're technically working to protect the king from assassination, but that's not why they're musketeers. That they all have their different reasons for being musketeers, but they definitely do have to grapple with what it means to want to be part of this sisterhood, this found family, this group of kick butt girls with swords, if it also means upholding an institution that is hurtful to all of them and to most of the people that they care about.
Okay, and then for my book, it is because my main character Ning is a commoner. When she travels to join the competition, she immediately encounters that there are some competitors that have more advantages than others. So she has to kind of grapple with that, with knowing how to get ahead in the competition and survive against these really terrible odds for her, because she doesn't have the background, she doesn't have the support of the money and the influence that a lot of her fellow competitors have. And so a lot of the rounds in the book is about her discovering these kind of societal forces that work against her and her trying to overcome it. So corruption is definitely an issue that is addressed in my book.
Yeah, I had originally wanted to ask how that relationship changes over time, but I've decided now in hindsight that feels a little bit too spoilery, and that people will just have to read the book to decide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about world as well, because we had talked a little bit about world building. I think can be so nuanced and complex, and deciding what details to include and what details not to include. I wanted to know what the easiest and hardest part of world building was, or creating setting basically for your book.
Mine was definitely the hardest. Was definitely time travel. I didn't realize it was going to be hard until I started writing it, and then I was really faced with like problem solving almost every paragraph of like, well, why didn't they just time travel to get out of this problem? So I was really, and also I really lost that really classic narrative technique of time jeopardy, where it's like you have to do this thing within a day or else. But so I couldn't do that either. I was really having to find ways to kind of continue to have stakes, continue to create tension without some of the traditional techniques that you need. But yeah, having said that, in a way, it was also the most fun aspect. Kind of, I really love problem solving. It was like doing a Wordle every few paragraphs.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. I would never write a time travel book because I know I'd mess it up. My copy editors yelled at me for messing up the time in my own book. World building for me was super fun because it's all sort of gritty sci-fi and not like super futuristic sci-fi because I don't feel like inventing technology. I'm not that smart. So mine's more of like the Star Wars thing where it's like, here's some communicators and that's good. But the world building for me was actually parts of the race were really easy because I based it off of the Iditarod, which is a real sled dog race. So I didn't have to come up with like, now they go across the river and then they go through the valley. Like that already existed. So for me, it sort of made a blueprint. And then with that blueprint, I had to figure out like, okay, what's the most challenging thing for my character in this section of the race? How is it going to be topped in the next section? How can I make this more dramatic or scary? So that was the easiest part. The hardest part for me was actually, I'm really light when I first draft. And so when my agent offered, our first like round of revision was adding more world building because I didn't really include like the economy or how the planet fit in with the other planets because I didn't even care, I guess, when I was drafting. So I had a lot of questions to answer and a lot of world building that I had to add in and find ways to make it less info dumpy so it didn't feel awkward. So that was the hard part for me.
See, this is so interesting to listen because for me, I think that the hardest part was, I had to do so much research. And I think that one of the really hard parts about One for All in particular is that I think that if people approach it looking for historical fiction, they're going to be a bit disappointed because I wanted to pay homage to Dumas because Dumas's Three Musketeers was not historical fiction. It was historical fantasy. Like his Paris is just a bit off. And I wanted to have that experience too. But I also didn't want to set it at the same time period as the original Three Musketeers because that I felt like I wouldn't be able to have a lot of intrigue and whodunit elements. So I was researching a period of time right after La Fronde, the French Civil War, and right before Versailles became a thing. So not a lot of people are really interested in that time period or do a lot of research about that time period because, quite frankly, the time periods on either side are much more interesting. So, me combing through JSTOR and trying to find scholarly articles, but also deciding what parts of history I wanted to play around with a bit. And linking back to the last question, I did not give the king a very nice he only appears he barely appears in the book, but when he does appear, he's not spoken of too nicely. And I kind of used his character ahistorically to talk about monarchy and talk about power. But I think that the easiest part for me was all the fencing and the swords because I already had the luxury of knowing a lot about that. So it was just a lot of fun to write, and I didn't have to worry that much about the world building aspect of it.
Nice.
So for me, I think the hardest part was definitely the timeline too. I'm so terrible at time. It's like, oh, suddenly like 1 hour has passed, but then the copy editor was like, actually, this time is not correct. You said that the moon rose on this day, but it's not possible because the moon rose 2 days ago, and now it's not supposed. And then so that was something that I really had to learn as I was writing, and just figuring out all those little details too, like how would they keep time during this period, and So my world is inspired by the Song Dynasty of Imperial China. And so I was able to bring in a lot of those little details just because I was always interested in that time period, since it was such a period of like cultural and societal advancement for the Imperial Chinese. So that aspect, I was able to pull a lot of those details, but I also like Lily was not writing like a really strict historical like fiction, and mine was actually second world fantasy, so I felt like I could draw a lot of those inspirations, but also not be restricted to just like it has to be true to the Song Dynasty period. So there's like some details from the Ming Dynasty in there, and then there might be like some details from the previous dynasties, and it was just really freeing to put some of those like we'll just put in whatever I want because it is it is a fantasy. So that was fun. Like that was an interesting part of world building, was just letting go of the research basically and then building what I want from it. So that was kind of a learning process for me as I was writing this book.
Yeah, and this is one question that I always ask for anyone creating anything with setting, basically. I wanted to know what a piece of your world or like a piece of your setting was that you edited out. I find it so fascinating to know like what almost made it into the book.
For me, I had actually initially set a prologue in Newgate Prison. I was initially going to have Joan, my main character, found in Newgate Prison, and I did all this research. I did so much research, but I ended up just cutting it out completely because it didn't make sense when I finally put the plot together.
I actually didn't cut out a lot of things. Like I said, I draft really lean, so I actually had to add in more stuff. I did sort of try and be really light when it came to all the dog sledding terms, just because I am not a dog sledder. I also don't live in a I live in a snowy place now, but when I wrote this, I did not. So a lot of my sort of details are light on purpose. But I feel really fortunate that like I didn't have to edit stuff. I had to add stuff.
I think that at least like 50,000 words have been cut, or 60,000 words have been cut from One for All, like over the course of its creation. I mean, probably more, honestly. Probably the total of words written for One for All was like over 300,000. But there was an entire subplot about Condé, and about Lefranc and the potential of Condé coming back. And my editor rightly said, the reader doesn't, one, they don't care about this. Two, it's just too many names. It's too much politics. And for the specific book that One for All is, and I agreed with that. I think that a lot of the details I'm not really sad about having to cut. I'm sad that I had to cut out like a lot of the backstory of the other girls and some of the scenes with the other girls, but what can you do? That's what editing is.
Yeah, and I did a lot of research into pottery out of all things because of the aspect of the tea in the world building. So there was a lot about like pottery and different kilns, and it was really interesting to me. But I know that if I wrote it, it would be really dry for the reader. So then that part was cut, and then also at the beginning of the book, originally it was supposed to be more about my main character with her role as a physician's apprentice, and like her grappling with the change of having to shift to like her mother's tea magic and stepping back into that. But a lot of that was cut just because it wasn't, it slowed down the beginning too much. So that was some of the world building that was removed. But maybe one day I'll write a story about pottery. Who knows? With all my additional knowledge in this area.
Yeah, maybe it could be like a short story that happens or something when, the main character is like walking through a street and like randomly sees someone who is working at a pottery shop, and then like story ensues. Um, I want to know also, how does one begin with a world building idea or setting? What is how does one sort of start building those blocks, I guess, of any setting, I suppose?
For me, I guess they all came together at the same time. I had initially started with, I wrote a list of all my favorite things. So I was just writing everything, every moment in all my favorite books that I loved the most, TV shows, characters. And then from there, I built kind of the world. So I was like, one of the things on my list was time travel, and I had a premise that I knew I was going to write from a monster point of view. So from there, I was really pulling ideas from my list to create a world, which included everything, included the setting, included, I guess, the rules of the world. And I spent maybe a couple of years even before I wrote any manuscript, just developing the world and doing research on the settings, some of which I didn't end up using. But it was a really fun process. I don't know, this is my first book that I've written, so I don't know if it was the most efficient process, but it was fun.
Oh my gosh, it was your first book? That's amazing. Sorry, I got distracted. Mine actually is really different. I read this tweet thread by this famous sled dog racer named Blair Braverman, which if you don't follow her, you should, because she posts pictures of dogs like all the time. It's adorable. Anyway, she told the story about like she was on the trail late at night. It was really creepy, and she kept seeing something in the woods, and she thought she was hallucinating because that happens when you're out in the woods in Alaska trying a sled dog race. But then her dog started reacting to this like dark figure. And so the story, like the tweet thread, makes it seem like it's basically a demon following her. And you get to the end of the thread and it's not a demon. It was a dude in like a full running suit, like a black running suit, like following her. And she was like, whoa. But that image of this like girl in the woods, this creepy woods with like this ice demon following her, that was like the core like image in my head. And so all my world building is kind of based on that. So I've got like creepy woods and all of these like ice demons, even though it's a sci-fi world, because I tried to make it fantasy and I couldn't. It just didn't work. So I turned it into sci-fi and then it all fell like into place. So yeah, my world building started with this one image of a girl being chased by a demon with her dog.
I was gonna say, I was about to say, I think that the runner dressed all in black following her is kind of scarier than the possibility of the demon following her.
Who runs on the
oh,
side,
this is
like,
so
in
much worse.
Alaska, in the snow. Like, you're crazy. Anyway.
So for me, I kind of really had I already had the base in that, there's the history of France. But I also took French starting when I was 6 or 7 years old, all the way through elementary, middle, high school, and part of college. So a lot of that also involved French history, French culture. So I was coming at it from that basis. So I knew a lot about France and French already. I also knew a lot about the Three Musketeers because of the book, because of The Man in the Iron Mask, which we watched every summer at fencing camp. So I knew the kind of world that I wanted to build and how I wanted it to be influenced by how Dumas built his world. And then I kind of, like I said earlier, I kind of like picked at stuff that maybe wasn't necessarily historically accurate. Like there's a scene, I don't think it's a spoiler, in which my main character gets the equivalent of compression stockings, but there wasn't actually any fabric in 17th century France or really anywhere that would mimic the kind of fabric that's compression stockings are made out of. But I was like, I don't want this scene, so I'm going to do it anyway. So a lot of the alternate ahistorical elements of One for All were just parts of me going, well, I don't want it to be historically accurate in this sense, so I'm just going to build it from there. And then also like lots of Easter eggs, allusions to The Princess Bride and the 2004 2005 Pride and Prejudice movie and all of that.
Yeah, I think that's the fun part too about writing something that you can kind of make your own. You add those little details that you are just drawn to, and it doesn't have to be accurate, but it's just fun for you and then fun for readers who have kind of that background. And that I approach it similarly as well. It's the story started with the idea of like what would magical tea look like what would that look like when you, for somebody who's practicing this type of magic, what sort of limitations would there be? And then it kind of, the research swung from that into like, yeah, what time period am I going to draw the details from? And then just having fun with, well, maybe this food wasn't around during this time, but I'm going to add it anyway because I like eating this food and I like thinking about it and writing it into my story. So yeah, it's just a lot of back and forth and playing around with it that way, and just expanding on the world, but as relevant to the story that I'm trying to tell. Because I mean, there's just so much that I can add, but I also didn't want to. I mean, I could go on for pages and pages about different types of food that I would enjoy, but I mean, the reader probably doesn't want to read that.
I mean, I would want to eat it.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say, like, the only really interesting food that appears in One for All is bread all the time, because I went gluten-free pretty much like right when I was editing it. So I was like, let me put in about all this stuff about bread. All the characters are eating bread, vicariously living through my characters. But your food descriptions are so good, Judy. I would read pages of them. Like, I think that you should just write, like, I want to read all the outtake pages of all the food descriptions, please.
There was a lot of late night food blog searching and trying to figure out and being very hungry while I was writing the book.
Yeah, I love, well, yes, I also would love some food accompanied with it. Maybe like what is it? Like a food pairing. So like recipes and food so that you can experience it kind of like one of those 4-dimensional or 4D kind of like sensory experiences. I want to pivot a little bit to talking about some books kind of in pairs. So the first one that I had was, I wanted to talk, and I know that we've talked a little bit already about like pieces, of a historical fiction time period or historical fiction fantasy mix that you would retain. But for Only a Monster and One for All, I wanted to, if possible, delve even deeper, I guess, into that idea about kind of what, has already been mentioned, this idea about historical accuracy, but also historical fiction/fantasy. And so this idea about pieces of the time period or pieces of that like history that you wanted to change, and then aspects that you hold on, I just completely put the two questions together. Yeah, so pieces of the time period that you wanted to retain versus pieces that you knew you wanted to change, and why. That's what I wanted to say.
I love the One for All setting so much. I felt like it was so immersive. I felt like you'd put in so many good details that you just really felt like you were there. I loved it so much. Yeah, mine is a time travel book. So we go to a few different time periods. We go to 1993. We go to a kind of quasi 17th century where we're actually outside of time, but it looks like, say, the Charles II era. And then we go to this to the future, which is a little bit undefined because we only travel within one house. So we don't see that much of it. But for me, yeah, I was definitely interested in making it feel authentic, although, of course, you can't include all of the details because most of them aren't known. I was really finding I was watching just like home videos that people had uploaded to YouTube of their, tourist experience in London in 1993. And it was kind of fun to see the cars, to see the, the big chunky cameras that they were all holding, no phones, the clothes. So I was really drawing, I guess, from people's tourist pictures at the time for my 1993 setting. And then I did a lot of research on the kind of Charles II era, even though we're only going to get to see Whitehall Palace itself. The thing that I changed was that I had wanted to really convey this feeling of the wonder of time travel. So I was really interested in portraying, if we're in this same place, what does it look like now? What does it look like when we time travel? What are all the interesting differences? But it did mean that when we went to Whitehall Palace, which had long burned down from the point of view of my history nerd buff main character Joan, I did a lot of research on Whitehall Palace, and I found out that all of the contemporary descriptions were like, they just keep breaking off from describing the palace just to say for like paragraphs how ugly the whole place was. They were like, this place is hideous, it's all mismatched buildings, it's awful. And then they would like go back to describing it. So I cut out the ugliness. I made it sound like it was much more beautiful than it was, because I had really wanted to convey a feeling of wonder. But yeah, I changed Whitehall Palace to make it beautiful. It wasn't.
I didn't have any time travel or historical, but I just want to say that I loved all of your Friends references in 1993. Okay, I'm done. Lily, on to you.
Oh no, I'm sorry. It was a great opportunity for me to like admire all of the Only a Monster copies in Vanessa's background. I'm so envious. They're all so gorgeous. I'm waiting on my sprayed edges copy. I'm very excited. It's coming in the mail soon. So I don't have it behind me here, but it will be soon. I think that so once I figured out that I was going to be writing a chronically ill character, or a character with POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is the chronic illness that I also have, I knew that immediately I was going to have to do a lot of shifting of history because of the way that history is written. And it's getting better because more perspectives are being addressed and included and written about, in whether that's in journals or in books, or even portrayed on the TV or in films. But there's not really a lot of chronic illness research into that time period. It's mostly about how doctors treated illness, and we all go, "Oh, look how ridiculous they were with their leeches and their, 4 humors, and oh, like we know so much better now." I think that Western medicine is, like it needs some work. All medicine needs some work, but I knew that going in, I was going to tell the story from the perspective of a chronically ill girl that also felt very modern, because a lot of the emotions that and situations that Tanya goes through are some of the similar situations that I went through as a teenager when I was chronically ill. So like the best friend breakup, when you first get sick, what it's like to worry about like guys not liking you if they find out you're sick or chronically ill, trying to downplay your chronic illness, not being believed if you're chronically ill, et cetera, et cetera. And technically, do I know that chronically ill girls had those exact experiences in 17th century France? No, because history hasn't really allowed that perspective. So I really thought, okay, I'm just going to do it anyway, because I think it's necessary and needed, and ableism isn't a modern thing. It's been around for a long time. So that I already knew going in I was going to play around with and definitely change in terms of history. And I tried to keep everything very similar to like the actual historical setting otherwise, because I didn't really know how far I could push the reader, because at some point, especially for historical fiction, and this is something that I'm always fascinated about, especially for writers who write specifically just historical fiction and not historical fantasy, there's a point at which like the reader tips over into disbelief, and it might not necessarily be because you included any facts that are untrue about that time period. Like, for example, Elizabeth May on Twitter talks about this all the time, about how readers will say, oh, I don't think that kind of window pane was around back then, so this doesn't feel historically accurate. And as the writer, I mean, yes, the window pane was around back then. It is historically accurate, but it's a kind of alchemy, a kind of magic trying to create this reader's belief in you as the narrator, as the writer, in your authorial ability. So I wanted to push in the areas that were really important to me when it came to chronic illness representation, stuff like that. And the stuff that I didn't care about as much, for example, specifically the, Le Marais, one of the richest neighborhoods in Paris at the time. I was like, I can write about it, historically accurately, because at the end of the day, it's not something that's incredibly important to me or to the story.
Yeah, I love that idea of like people not believing also just like things that legitimately happened in real life. I feel like that is, I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts about that. But anyway.
I was going to say really quickly too that I think that I got away a lot because I talked to whether it's disability or chronic illness or an ableism or it's racism or it's sexism or it's homophobia. I think that there are some readers who'll be like, well, that doesn't sound like something that somebody would say to somebody else. I don't believe that. And I know that, for example, I've heard from Katie Gardner, who wrote Brave Enough, like there are readers who are like, oh, but people don't talk to kids who have cancer like that. But because it was a One for All, an historical fantasy setting, I think that people were more willing to accept certain levels of ableism because they're like, oh, it was ye olden days. People were like that back then. It's fine. So I got away with a lot more.
Yeah. I want to pivot to a different topic entirely. I wanted to talk about in Cold the Night Fast the Wolves and the Magic Steeped in Poison. There's obviously competition and like ranking, in a competition, there's obviously ranking, but competition and ranking, I did separate them a little bit because I do think they have certain differences. But I wanted to talk about if you could talk us through, or both of you could talk us through the thought processes for the structure of the challenges, and like the pacing, balancing pacing within these kind of competition frameworks, and sort of the character growth in relation to like the plot. I don't know. I'm not a writer. So obviously all of these things seem very like how. So I just want to know how.
Yeah, I can start. So like I said earlier, like luckily I used the Iditarod as a blueprint. So I didn't have to come up with challenges. Good job, Judy. I don't know how I would do that. I'm not very good at surviving the wilderness. So luckily I had like all of these great examples. What I had to do to kind of make it different was so it didn't get repetitive. The biggest threat in my whole story is the threat of death. It's literally there the entire time. And if you kind of drive that home a lot, it can really get tiresome for readers. They're like, yeah, we know people can die, blah, blah, blah. And it just doesn't feel very impactful. So you have to find ways to like engage the readers in such a way like, okay, well, here we're in this place and this is where it's hard, to survive. But how does Senna, how does the main character, make a decision? How does she tell us like what she's going to do? How do we make this harder and scarier? I often threw in wild animals, because that's scary. Or they ran out of food at one part. So like it was more of just building on what was already there and trying to make it so you could see like how Senna's decisions changed like what came next. And I think like as far as pacing goes, for me, the plot and the character like growth is the same. So everything that's happening in the race is something that is pushing Senna to where she needs to be, whether she wants to do it or not. So like there was no one challenge that didn't exist, that wasn't part of her character growth. So they just like continue in the same sort of trajectory. That way it's not boring to the readers and it doesn't feel repetitive, because every time, you know, she's faced with this challenge, she grows in some way, especially in her relationship with Iska, the wolf. That's sort of the main, my book doesn't have romance. Instead, I have this like friendship between a girl and a wolf. So every challenge I had to bring them like closer together, sort of like a romance, but not like a romance, because again, it's not that kind of book. But yeah, so character growth, pacing, all that stuff is like together with the plot. Every challenge should like push them together, or make them rely on each other, or make them see each other in a different way. So that's sort of how I thought about it while I was drafting.
Yeah, no, I really loved that relationship between Senna and her wolf. I thought that was just so like interesting to put them in those situations, and then I was like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen to them? And so I thought you did that really well.
That's the goal, right? What's gonna happen next?
Yeah, it's like, what's gonna happen next? Oh no, something terrible.
Yes.
Like, I was like, I know she's not gonna kill the wolf, but I would be very, very upset if something like really horrible happened.
I spoil it every time I have like a discussion with people that haven't read it. I'm like, the wolf does not die. And they're like, oh, thank God. People die, but not the wolf.
Yes. For my competition rounds, so I knew that it had to escalate in urgency and that it has to progressively get harder and harder. But I mean, I always love reading stories with competitions. So when I thought, oh, okay, this will be a good way for my character to achieve what she wants, which is to save her sister. But then I realized that I was the one who had to come up with the competition. And then so that took a lot of time and effort just to think about like what would be the best way to make the challenges unique. So they all had to address different things, like, and different. So it's very tied to the magic, because the competition is to get the court 神农氏, so the tea magician that would serve the emperor. So they have to kind of prove themselves and exhibit an understanding and a grasp of the different variations on tea magic. So that's, and I also thought about like what would make it, give it the different variety, what would make it interactive as well, so that it's not just her pouring different types of tea, because that wouldn't be very interesting to read about time and time again. But how would I involve, how does the tea influence other people? And then, or how, in what ways are, like when we talked about the corruption, like in what ways are the other competitors backstabbing each other, trying to take advantage? How would they do that? What would that involve? Is there anything that involves the judges? But access to ingredients, things like that. And then also, and I also really enjoy stories about like solving puzzles. So just coming up with like different puzzles and how to incorporate that into the competition, so that there would be some exploration of that. So that's, and then I kind of tied it to like different virtues, so that there would be kind of a theme to the competition, because just because in a court, in like the Chinese imperial court and all these the dramas that it's inspired by, there's always a lot of ritual and a lot of like references to the classics and history and philosophy. So that's also what I drew inspiration from in order to center each of the rounds of the competition around a particular virtue. So that was a little bit of the world building that I brought in with the various competition rounds.
I wanted to pop in as well and remind people that they can start kind of dropping Q&A questions if you have them in the chat. I'm going to switch over. I have a few more that are a little bit like more in depth, but I want to switch over to some more lightning kind of quick ones. I wanted to know, if you spent the day with your main character in our world, maybe you can pick if it's like at what point you want to spend, in their character journey, what point you want to spend with them. But if you could spend a day with your main character in our world, what would you do during your day, like here, I guess?
I feel like I'd have a super nerdy day. My main character is super nerdy. I would visit the V&A Museum with her because she's a kind of history nerd. I love London. I guess we'd have afternoon tea, and she's lived all over London because her family moves every year because, well, maybe they're being hunted, who knows. So so I would also get her to show me all the cool parts of London, which I didn't know about because I'm sure she's an expert and knows everything. That's what I would do.
Oh, that sounds so fun. I would have to take Senna to a beach because she's never ever seen the ocean because she lives on an ice planet of doom. And I hate snow too, so I wouldn't go anywhere snowy. So I'd probably be like, look, this is what an ocean looks like. It's so warm. Isn't it great? And then, Iska the wolf could play in the surf and it would be a great day at the beach.
I'm waffling between. I would love to take Tanya to like a modern day fencing competition so she could see what it was actually like. But I also feel like I owe it to Tanya to take her to therapy. I'm like, my poor characters, I put them through so much. Like, oh gosh, like she needs like modern day access to therapy. But she would love a current fencing competition. She'd probably be pretty freaked out by the whole like electricity thing and the lights going off and all the sounds, but I think that would be part of the fun for her too.
For me, I think I would take Ning to a night market and we would just go around and eat a bunch of things because that's what she would be interested in, considering that at her village there's not really a lot of access to different types of food. So then when she's at the palace, she's fascinated by all these different foods. So I think it would be fun. And probably for me to eat all the things too. So I'm very food focused apparently from my conversation here.
Can I come?
Yes, we will go and eat all the things.
Yeah, I think we all should go with you, Judy. When you said that, Meg, I was thinking like about that scene in Frozen with Olaf, and like imagining how Olaf like is just losing it over it, like warmth and summer. I feel like them together would be super fun.
Yes, she's not ready for the heat.
I wanted to talk as well about why you chose your world and not contemporary. I know that there are some where like there, for Vanessa's, like obviously there's some, in contemporary, but I mean like specifically kind of always set in contemporary, like what attracted you to the non-contemporary world?
I guess I was interested in, we jump around. So we start in the contemporary world, which in a way required as much research as the historical periods and was a little bit more scary to me because I'm not from London. I've only been there twice, and there are so many, like there's like a million billion experts of London who live in London. So, and know the time period because they're living in it. So in a way, it was easier to think about writing the 90s, which is, if people have lived through the 90s, I'm sure it's faded a little bit in their memory and they can't remember every single detail. So I felt a little bit, although as I think quite a few of us have talked about, you want to create a feeling of authenticity, and that's in a way more important than actual authenticity. So I was really going for feelings of authenticity. And I guess I chose the 90s because as really my main setting, because I wanted Joan to be just far from home. So she's a modern day girl. She goes and travels back to before she was born. And it's not so different that it's not an urban fantasy anymore. It's still an urban fantasy, but she's cut off from every friend and family that she knows. And she's really got to work with this, this monster boy to further their goals. So yeah, I chose the 90s because it was not too long ago that it's unfamiliar, but it's long enough ago that it's a little bit interesting for time travel.
I don't read contemporary much unless it's like an adult romance. I apparently can't write anything that's not speculative in some way. I feel like I live in the real world, and the whole point for me to write and read is to get away from the real world. So I want to have my characters exist in places where they can have giant wolf companions, or, sled race through an ice planet and kill demons chasing them. I love that element of fantastical, whether it's sci-fi or fantasy. To me, that just makes the story, like, it's amazing to me that writers can write these fantastical elements, but you still relate so much to the characters. Like, that shouldn't make sense, but yet it does every time you read a book. So I love that.
I was gonna say, I think that listening to Vanessa talk about Only a Monster and about time traveling back to the 90s, it's like the one thing that is like wow, the young adult readers are like, wow, the 90s are such a long time ago, and I'm sitting here going like, wow, I was born in the 90s. This is weird. Reckoning with age, fun, and as a young adult author, I think that I wish that I could say that, I thought long and hard about, whether or not I wanted to do a reimagining that was set in contemporary times, but it honestly never even crossed my mind. I just kind of happened. I started writing it set during that time period. I had never written historical fiction before, but I had a lot of fun doing it. And like Meg, I'm not really that much of a contemporary fiction fan. I do love contemporary fiction with speculative elements. And I have been reading a lot of 22 Debuts contemporary novels. Supporting 22 Debuts, woo! But I wanted to be able to have like this element of also girls dueling in ball gowns. And unfortunately, we don't spend a lot of time in ball gowns anymore. So I had to go with the historical fantasy setting.
My draw was I like what Vanessa had said about like contemporary. If you write something contemporary, there's actual people living in that space, and then they're going to be like, no, that street doesn't exist, or no, that's not the way it should be. And then so part of me was like scared of that, so that's why I like to write in the past and also in secondary worlds, because I made it up. So you can't tell me it's not right, because it is what I made up. So but I watch a lot of like period dramas and historical dramas, so that's just my interest a lot. So that's why I like writing in those worlds and playing around in them, and then and adding a little bit of that fantastical element is always fun for me. So that's why I chose the setting that I did, just because it's in media that I enjoy. So I like exploring those worlds and writing them, and maybe one day I will tackle contemporary fantasy, because that's what I read too. Even if I read a contemporary story, there's usually some sort of fantastical or like sci-fi element to it. So I don't think I'll ever write just a straight contemporary story.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. What is your favorite book?
Oh my gosh, this is so hard. I'm gonna go with House Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I read somewhere that often your favorite books are the ones that you read kind of at a formative age. So I'm going with a kind of middle grade, very early YA, House Moving Castle. It's by one of my favorite authors, Diana Wynne Jones. It's amazing. I just feel like she writes fantasy with so much conviction. It's like it's a real thing, and I always aspire to that as well. And it's just this really cute romance, and a kind of a weirdly unconventional romance, because at the beginning, the main character Sophie gets cursed so that she appears to be an old woman, and she spends most of the book in disguise as an old woman. But yeah, I love the world building. I don't know, I love the humor. And yeah, she's just so creative.
I cannot tell you a favorite book. It's like asking a favorite movie. It really depends on my mood. But I will tell you a book that I loved reading in the last year, and that was Iron Widow by Sharon J. Zhao. It was just mind-blowing, and every time I turned the page, I was just like, what is happening? So if you're interested and you've seen the book around, which I'm sure you have, and you haven't read it yet, you should definitely pick it up because it's intense and awesome, and it's great.
Like Meg, I think whenever I'm asked what my favorite book is, like I have the inhale of terror. I'm like, no. Any other question? One, because whenever anybody asks me a question about books that I've read or books that I'm reading, every single title I've ever read or am reading flies out of my head. It's just gone. So there's that. I think that the book that I think was the most important for me when I was growing up, like Vanessa said about, our books being read, our favorite books being read at a very formative age was probably Jane Eyre. And my copy of Jane Eyre actually fell apart from that time period, as in like the spine broke off and the glue kind of broke, and now it's kind of disintegrating. But probably my favorite book that I've read in the past few years, I have my little visual aid right here, is Legendborn by Tracy Deonn, and Bloodmarked is coming out soon, which people should pre-order.
Lily, you stole mine. I was gonna say Legendborn. No, because I read it that last year and I really loved it. It was just, I think, contemporary fantasy at its like finest, because it was such a great reimagining, and just like such a great spin of like Arthurian legends, and the ending just like blew me away. So that is definitely a highly recommended book. And then, so now I have to think of another one I enjoyed recently. I really liked Within These Wicked Walls. That's also another reimagining. But it was just the way she just took it so that it took it into another setting, and then the magic was really interesting how she incorporated it, and it felt really immersive, and it was one of the, I really like stories where like you were kind of like really worried about what's going to happen to the main character. There was a lot of like blood and like just one of those like what is happening, and then I was like physically afraid for her as I was reading the story late into the night. So Within These Wicked Walls, that was another one that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I feel like this question, I saw that and I was like, oh, I'm really glad that that's not my question. Like, that's not a question directed to me. But then I felt bad. So I will answer, and I will say that one I just finished that comes out in May, actually, is See You Yesterday by Rachel Lynn Solomon, which has a time loop. So it's not time travel. I guess, is it? I don't know. Time loop. That's all I'll say. And then another question that we got from the audience was, what book did you read that was essential to you eventually writing these books, or like this book? I thought that was super fascinating question.
I feel like unintuitively for me, it was probably Game of Thrones. I was really interested in the way that he was harnessing that classical structure of the hero's journey to kind of play with your expectations. So, as you know, the main character, I hope this is not going to be a spoiler for anyone, the main character, Ned, has, starts on a very classic hero's journey structure, which is like a very classic fantasy structure where, you see him in his ordinary world. He has a call to adventure to become the hand of the king. He crosses a threshold into King's Landing, meets allies, enemies, starts to have tests, which is all the classic structure. And as a reader, you I know what's going to happen. He's going to pass these tests. But no, he just gets executed. Like, he fails the first test immediately. And I was just really fascinated. I hadn't seen the hero's journey harnessed like that before. So I was like, oh, because I love a twist. So I was really thinking I'm going to try and like harness, reader expectations through structure, and then kind of try to subvert those expectations to to create some twists. So I would say, yeah, very unintuitively, Game of Thrones was really important to the way kind of I was learning how to write, and particularly write twists.
That's an awesome example. I think actually I have to go back to my formative years for this question, because I mean, once I knew I wanted to write about a girl and a wolf, it was like, let me go back to all of the wolf books I read as a kid, because I feel like when I was in school, there was a bunch. You have to read Call of the Wild. You had to read Julie of the Wolves. I read one called Red Fox. Don't read it. It's really sad. It's really sad. Stone Fox, not Red Fox. But like all of these books are sort of frontier books. They're, steeped with like American frontier lore. And so I kind of wanted to capture that same feeling when I was writing my book, even though it's not an American frontier book. The corporations are clearly the bad guys. So those were sort of the books that really informed how Cold the Night, Fast the Wolves felt and vibed.
I feel like there's a very easy answer, and I'm not gonna do it because I could very easily answer the Three Musketeers and just be done with it. I think that probably Tamora Pierce's books were really influential, and as far as One for All was concerned, The Princess Bride, which is also like, I love it. I mean, it's very different in that it's satire, so it's very different from One for All, but and oh gosh. And also I think that there's also an element of like it was more of a lack of books as to why I wrote One for All and to where One for All came from, because I didn't have that representation when I was a chronically ill teenager. So it was more of like writing into the space that felt like it was empty, that it didn't really have anything there for me, and I wanted to fill that space.
And the book that influenced me while I was writing Magic Steeped in Poison was The Star Touched Queen by Roshani Chokshi, just because it just felt so lush and immersive. Like the world she created was just beautiful, and it really felt like I could like smell and touch and taste everything. And so that was kind of what I wanted to convey, was just that I'm hoping that when a reader picks up my book, that they would feel like they would be stepping back in time into this palace with all the different teas and the scents and the sights. So that was what really influenced me while I was writing.
I know that we are over an hour, but the last question we got, which I thought was a really great place to end it on, was basically advice for aspiring teen writers. So if people will humor me, that would be the last question that I think would be fun to end on.
I feel like my advice is, I guess I've got two pieces of advice. My first piece is, try to make connections with other writers. I know that you probably have other writers in your life already. I know that when I started talking about my own writing, I've just found so many of my friends were also thinking about writing books. People at work, probably people at your school that you're already friends with, are thinking about writing. So you just talk about your writing, and you might be surprised by how many other people who are out there or in your life already who would be a support for you. And then my other piece of advice, which might not work for everybody, but it definitely worked for me, was really think about the kinds of stories that you like, because for me, it took me a while to write this book, and I feel like I was really sustained by the fact that I was pulling from things that I liked when in my own world building. So it was kind of fun for me to write.
Good advice. My advice is that you don't have to have a degree to do this. I taught myself how to be a writer using the internet. So don't feel like you have to spend money or you can't learn because you don't have access to classes. Anyone can be a writer, and it doesn't matter how old you are. So like if you're 18, if you're 16, if you're 53, that doesn't make you any better or worse than anybody else. So don't be discouraged if somebody tries to tell you that you don't know what you're doing because you're young. That's BS.
So I feel bad about saying mine because the piece of advice that came before me were so great. My piece of advice is to not listen to advice. Whoops. Cue the sounds of terror, of like just gasps of English teachers everywhere. I think that a lot of the time the rules that people say about writing, like you have to write every day to be a writer or stuff like that, are classes today ableist, and like there's rooted in so much prejudice, and I think that nobody benefits from gatekeeping writing. So I think that the best thing to do is just figure out a way that writing works for you, and don't worry about whether or not someone says that it's the right way or the wrong way, because you're a writer if you want to be.
Yeah, I love that. I think that took me a little while to learn, because I always thought, oh, I had to be a certain way, like I have to try and write and get a little bit in every day, and it just wasn't feasible, and I think that just stressed me out more than I should have. And I think that for me it was just, I think writing should be fun. I think it should be something that you enjoy. And so the way I wrote for the longest time was I wrote a lot of fan fiction, because it was kind of freeing for me to play around somebody else's world without like having to do all of that extra world building and all of it. And that really helped me as a writer, just being able to develop craft and my writing skills. And I know that a lot of times people look down a lot on people who like writers who write fan fiction, but I think it's pretty common. It's more often than you think that some of your favorite authors is probably still writing fan fiction today. Or so I think it's just, yeah, write what you enjoy, and then still have lots of time to figure it out. Oh, I guess that's the one thing, is that don't think that just because you haven't been published in your like early 20s that you're done. I mean, I am in my mid 30s and that's when I debuted. So lots of people publish later in their life, and so you shouldn't feel stressed that you don't have a book deal by the time you're like 20, because that's not the norm.
Yeah, I love that. I'm glad that we could squeeze that in, because I think that all of that's really helpful, and I think that it's just, I don't know, this is a positive note to end, to end the NL on. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to our chat for chatting with us. It was, I love the chat, the chats in the chat. And yeah, just thank you all for coming. And I think that the bookshop.org links for all the books are in the description. So just a reminder to pick up the books, put them on hold, library, like, you know, I was going to say pre-order, but don't pre-order them. They're already out. So you can order them, take them out from the library, read them, and then enjoy them with everybody else and all of us. So thank you all, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. All right. Have a great day, afternoon, evening, whatever it is for you all. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.